Roy was not the kind of man who talked much. He did his work, kept his head down, and asked for nothing from anyone. 3 years at Valdres Academy and he still ate his lunch alone behind the eastern shed, watching the silverleaf trees move in the wind while the alien faculty laughed loudly inside the dining hall. That was fine with Roy. He was not there to make friends. He was there because the pay was steady and the work made sense to him. Cut this. Clear that. Fix the broken path before someone trips. Simple things. Honest things. Valdres Academy sat on a wide green hill on the planet Sorvin. The buildings were tall and dark, made from old stone that turned almost blue when the afternoon light hit it a certain way. There were long pathways, quiet gardens, and wide courtyards where alien students gathered in small groups to study and argue and laugh. It was a beautiful place. Roy had thought so from the first day he arrived. But the most beautiful part, in his opinion, was the back section. Past the storage buildings, past the broken fountain that nobody had bothered to repair in years, past the last row of silver trees, there was a corner of the campus that the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten. The stone arch back there had partially collapsed a long time ago. Thick green moss covered everything. The ground was soft and uneven. Roots pushed up through the old pathway stones. Nobody ever went there. Roy went every Thursday. He told himself it was because that section still needed maintenance even if nobody cared. And that was partly true. But the real reason was simpler. It was quiet back there. Completely quiet. No faculty walking past without looking at him. No students stepping around him like he was a post in the ground. Just birds and wind and the soft sound of his own boots on wet moss. That Thursday started like every other one. Roy collected his tools from the shed before sunrise, drank his coffee standing up because there was no chair in the shed, and walked the long way around the storage buildings to reach the back section. The sky above Sorvin was still pale, not quite light yet, with just a thin line of orange sitting low on the horizon. He started working near the old arch, pulling out a thick tangle of roots that had pushed up through the stones near the base. It was slow work. The roots were deep and stubborn. Roy did not mind. He had nowhere else to be. He had been working for about 20 minutes when he heard it. He stopped. It was a small sound. Very small. Like wind moving through a thin crack in the stone. But it had a pattern to it. Short and quiet and repeated. Roy straightened up and stood completely still, listening. There it was again. He moved slowly toward the collapsed side of the arch, stepping carefully over the loose stones. He crouched down near the base where two large rocks leaned together and created a hollow space behind them. He pushed aside a curtain of long hanging roots with one hand. He saw the nest. It was built from dried branches, dark mud, and what looked like pieces of thick bark pressed together. It sat perfectly in the hollow between the two rocks, sheltered from wind and rain. Whoever had built it had chosen the spot well. Inside the nest were 4 small creatures. Roy had never been this close to dragon hatchlings before. He had seen adult dragons twice in his life, both times from a great distance. But he knew immediately what these were. They were about the size of a large cat, maybe a little smaller. Their scales were a dull gray color, not yet fully formed. Their wings were pressed flat against their small bodies. Their eyes were closed. And they were making that sound. It was barely a sound at all. More like a breath with a small cry attached to the end of it. But all 4 of them were doing it, one after the other, and it did not stop. Roy looked around slowly. No adult dragon. No sign that any large creature had been near this spot recently. The ground around the nest was cold and undisturbed. On one side of the nest, 2 broken eggshells sat at the edge of the hollow, already dried out completely. He reached his hand in carefully, moving slowly so as not to frighten them. One of the hatchlings turned its small head toward the warmth of his fingers. Its mouth opened just slightly. It stretched its tiny neck forward. It was looking for food. Roy looked at the other 3. They were all thin. He could see it even under the scales. The way their small sides moved when they breathed, too fast, too shallow. One of them was pressed into the corner of the nest and not moving much at all. He pulled his hand back gently and sat on the cold ground beside the nest. He rested his arms on his knees and looked at them for a while. The academy had an entire department for the study of bonded creatures. There were professors who had written long books about dragon behavior. There were staff members whose only job was managing the relations between the academy and the native wildlife of Sorvin. None of them were here. Roy was. He looked at the hatchling that had turned toward his hand. It had settled back down now, its small head resting on the edge of the nest, its eyes still closed. Roy stood up slowly. He tucked his gloves into his belt. He picked up his bag from the ground and turned toward the path that led back to the main building. The kitchen staff started their prep work early. If he got there before the morning rush, he could probably get something without too many questions. He walked a little faster than usual. The kitchen staff at Valdres Academy started work at 4 in the morning. Roy started at 5. But the day after he found the nest, he was at the kitchen door by 3:30, standing in the dark with his hands in his jacket pockets, waiting for the light inside to come on. When it did, he knocked twice. The cook who opened the door was a broad alien named Cesra with 4 arms and a permanent look of mild irritation on his flat gray face. He looked at Roy for a moment without speaking. Roy asked if there were any scraps from the night before. Leftover meat, soft vegetables, anything that was going to be thrown out anyway. Cesra stared at him. Roy explained that he was not asking for much. Just whatever was not going to be used. Cesra made a low sound in his throat, turned around and came back a minute later with a cloth bag that smelled strongly of cooked meat and old broth. He held it out without a word. Roy took it, said thank you and walked back out into the dark. That was how it started. He did not know what dragon hatchlings were supposed to eat. He did not have time to find out properly. So he used what he had. He tore the meat into very small pieces, smaller than his thumbnail, and placed them one at a time at the edge of the nest. The hatchlings were slow to respond at first. They were weak and confused and the smell of a human was strange to them. But hunger is a powerful thing. By the 3rd piece, the nearest hatchling had lifted its head. By the 5th, it had eaten directly from Roy's fingers. The others followed slowly, one by one, each of them taking small careful bites from his open palm. Roy sat in the cold dark of the back section every morning for the next 6 days and did exactly that. He was not fast about it. He did not rush them. He let them come to his hand on their own time and he replaced any piece they dropped. The smallest one, the one that had been pressed into the corner barely moving, took 4 full days before it ate anything at all. Roy waited. He came back the next morning and tried again. And the morning after that. On the 4th morning it finally ate. Roy let out a long breath and sat back against the cold stone of the arch and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. Word got around eventually. It always did in a place like the academy. The first person to say something was a man named Doug who worked in the facilities department and had been at the academy longer than almost anyone else on the human staff. Doug was not a bad man. He was practical. He found Roy eating lunch alone behind the shed one afternoon and sat down across from him without being invited. He told Roy that he had heard about the nest. Roy kept eating. Doug said that the back section was not a good place to be spending time. He said that dragon nests on campus grounds were considered a serious problem by the alien faculty, not because of the dragons themselves but because of the politics involved. Bonded creatures had complicated legal standing on Sorvin. Getting mixed up in that was not something a groundskeeper needed on his record. Roy nodded slowly. Doug said he was just trying to help. He said Roy should leave the nest alone and let the natural process happen. He used that phrase twice. The natural process. Roy thanked him for the advice. The next morning he was back at the kitchen door at 3:30 with his cloth bag. 2 days after that, a woman named Petra from the Academy's Creature Relations office stopped him on the main path between the gardens. Petra was efficient and spoke quickly and carried a narrow tablet that she typed on while she talked. She told Roy that there had been a report filed about unsanctioned interaction with native wildlife on campus grounds. She did not say who filed it. She explained that any contact with bonded creature offspring without proper authorization was a violation of Sorvin's wildlife statutes and could result in his employment being reviewed. Roy listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished he asked her one question. He asked if anyone from the Creature Relations office had been to check on the nest. Petra looked at her tablet. She typed something. She said that the nest had been logged but that an assessment visit had not yet been scheduled. Roy asked how long ago it had been logged. She typed again. She said 11 days. Roy nodded. He thanked her for letting him know. He picked up his tool bag from the ground where he had set it and continued walking toward the back section. Petra called after him that she was serious about the review. Roy raised one hand without turning around to show that he had heard her. That evening he stopped at the small market near the eastern gate and spent a portion of his own pay on dried protein strips that the market owner said were commonly used for young carnivores. He cut them into pieces that night at his small kitchen table, working by lamplight, and packed them into the cloth bag alongside the scraps from Cesra. He set his alarm for 3 in the morning. He was not sure exactly what he was doing or how it was going to end. He was not a dragon expert. He was not authorized by anyone. He had no plan beyond the next morning. But 4 small creatures were alive that might not have been. And tomorrow morning they would be hungry again. That was enough for Roy. It was the 10th night when things went wrong. Roy had started doing an evening check after his shift ended. It was not something he had planned. The first time he did it, he told himself he was just walking that way anyway. The second time he did not bother with an excuse. He simply went. That evening the sky above Sorvin had turned dark early. Thick clouds had moved in from the northern hills during the afternoon, and by the time Roy finished his shift the temperature had already dropped sharply. He could feel it through his jacket. A cold that had teeth in it. He walked faster than usual. When he reached the back section and pushed aside the hanging roots, he knew immediately that something was wrong. 3 of the hatchlings stirred at the sound of him. They lifted their heads and made their small quiet sounds and shifted toward the warmth of his presence the way they had learned to do over the past 10 days. The 4th one did not move. It was the smallest, the one that had taken 4 days to eat. Roy had quietly started thinking of it as the stubborn one because it reminded him a little of himself. Always the last to ask for anything. Always the one that needed the most time. He reached into the nest carefully and touched its side. It was cold. Far too cold. Its small chest was moving but barely. The breaths were too far apart, too shallow, with a slight tremor between each one. Its eyes were closed tight and its legs were drawn up under its body like it was trying to make itself as small as possible. Roy pulled his hand back and looked at it for a moment. He had no medicine. He had no equipment. He had no authorization and no training, and nobody was coming to help him because nobody else had been coming to this corner of the campus for as long as he had worked here. He had his jacket and he had his body heat and he had the rest of the night. He reached in and very slowly, very gently, lifted the small hatchling out of the nest. It was lighter than it should have been. He could feel the faint tremble in its body against his palms. He opened his jacket and held the hatchling against his chest, then closed the jacket around it as best he could, keeping one hand pressed gently over it from the outside. Then he sat down against the stone arch with his back against the cold rock and settled in. The other 3 hatchlings made unhappy sounds for a few minutes. Then one of them climbed to the edge of the nest and looked at him. Then it climbed out. It moved in that clumsy sideways way that hatchlings moved, all uneven steps and dragging wings, and it pressed itself against Roy's leg. The second one followed. Then the third. Roy sat in the dark with 4 dragon hatchlings and did not move. The night on Sorvin was long and the ground was hard and the cold came up through the stone and into his back and stayed there. His legs went stiff after the first hour. His shoulder ached from the angle he was holding his arm at to keep the jacket closed. At some point he drifted close to sleep and then pulled himself back because he wanted to keep feeling the small chest against his own, wanted to make sure the breathing was still there. It was still there. Slower than he would have liked. But there. He talked to them a little. Not because he thought they understood. Just because it felt better than silence. He talked about the town he had grown up in. About his mother's garden. About the first job he had ever worked, sweeping a warehouse floor at 15 for almost nothing. About how he had ended up on Sorvin of all places, following a work contract that seemed like a good idea at the time and had turned out to be exactly that, just a good idea, nothing more dramatic than that. The hatchlings did not respond. But they stayed close. Around the 3rd hour Roy became aware of something at the edge of the back section. A soft sound. Careful footsteps on the stone path. He turned his head slowly. 3 alien students stood at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the dark. They were young, 1st or 2nd year by the look of them. One held a small lamp that gave off a pale blue light. They were staring at him. Roy looked at them. They looked at him. He turned back to the hatchlings and kept his hand pressed gently against his jacket. He heard whispered conversation behind him but could not make out the words. Then the footsteps moved away and it was quiet again. By the 5th hour the hatchling against his chest had stopped trembling. The breathing was still soft but it had steadied, each breath coming at a regular pace now, no longer uncertain. Roy pressed his palm flat against his jacket and felt the small warmth growing there. Not just his warmth. Its own warmth coming back. When the sky above the trees began to go from black to deep gray, Roy carefully opened his jacket. The hatchling blinked. Its eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the pale early light. It looked up at Roy's face for a long moment. Then it made a very small sound and tucked its head back down against his chest. Roy closed his jacket again. By full sunrise there were 11 students standing at the tree line. Some had brought others. They stood in complete silence watching a tired, cold, underpaid human groundskeeper sit on the hard ground with 4 dragon hatchlings pressed against him like he was the warmest thing in the world. For them that night he had been. Roy heard her before he saw her. It was early morning, about a week after the cold night. He had just finished the daily feeding and was packing up his cloth bag when a sound moved through the back section that he had never heard before. It was low and deep and it came from somewhere above the tree line. Not loud exactly. but the kind of sound that made your body pay attention before your mind caught up. The birds went silent first. Then the wind seemed to stop. Roy slowly set his bag down on the ground and stood up straight. The 4 hatchlings who had been moving around his feet in their clumsy sideways way, suddenly went completely still. The smallest one pressed itself against Roy's boot and did not move. He looked up. She came over the trees slowly. Not fast. She was too hurt to move fast. Her wingspan was enormous, wide enough to block out a large piece of the pale morning sky, and her scales were a deep greenish gray, the color of old river stone. But one of her wings was not opening fully. It dragged slightly on the left side, the movement uneven and stiff. There were marks along her left flank, long and dark, that Roy did not want to look at too closely. She had been in a fight. A bad one. She came down in the open ground just beyond the collapsed arch, landing heavily, her good wing folding tight and her injured one settling at a painful angle. The impact of her landing sent a small shudder through the ground that Roy felt through the soles of his boots. She was enormous up close. Her head alone was larger than Roy's entire body. Her eyes were a pale amber color, almost gold, and they were fixed directly on him with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Roy did not run. He was not particularly brave. He was not trained for anything like this. His heart was hitting the inside of his chest so hard he could feel it in his throat. But his feet did not move and he did not reach for anything and he did not make any sudden motion that might read as a threat. He simply stood there. The mother drew her head back and made a sound that was not quite a roar. It was shorter than that, sharper, a warning sound, the kind of sound that said very clearly that she was deciding something and the decision might not go well for whoever was standing in front of her. Roy held both hands open at his sides. She took one step forward. Her good front leg moved with surprising quiet for something so large. Her injured side dragged just slightly. She was in pain. Roy could see it in the way she held herself, the tightness around her jaw, the way her breathing was slightly too controlled, like she was managing it deliberately. She had come back hurt and exhausted, and the first thing she had seen near her nest was a human. Roy understood exactly why she was ready to kill him. He did not move. The hatchlings had not run. That was the thing. A mother dragon expecting to find her young frightened or scattered or gone would have found confirmation of the worst. But the 4 of them were there, right there, pressed close to Roy's feet and legs, the smallest one still leaning against his boot. They were not frightened of him. They were using him as a windbreak. The mother's eyes moved from Roy to the hatchlings. Then back to Roy. Then to the hatchlings again. Her head lowered slightly. Roy watched her eyes change. It was subtle. The sharp, focused intensity shifted into something else, something that was less like rage and more like confusion. She had come back ready for the worst, and the worst was not here. What was here was 4 living hatchlings in better condition than she had left them, pressing themselves calmly against the legs of a human groundskeeper with an empty cloth bag at his feet. She made a different sound then. Quieter. Shorter. The hatchlings responded immediately. All 4 of them moved toward her, stumbling over each other in their hurry, making their small sounds. She lowered her great head to them and they climbed over her snout and pressed against her jaw, and she made a low continuous sound that moved through the ground like a slow vibration. Roy stood completely still and watched. After a long moment she lifted her head again and looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. Roy was aware of sounds returning to the back section. Birds starting again somewhere in the trees, a breeze moving through the leaves above. The world coming back to itself. Then the mother did something that Roy did not expect. She lowered her head. Not to the hatchlings. To him. She brought that enormous head down slowly, all the way down, until her jaw was resting on the cold ground directly in front of Roy's feet. Her amber eyes looked up at him from below. She held that position and did not move. Roy stared at her. He had no idea what the gesture meant in any formal sense. He was a groundskeeper. He trimmed hedges and fixed broken paths. He did not speak dragon and he had never read a single book about their culture or their behavior. But some things do not need translation. He crouched down slowly until he was at her eye level. He reached out one hand carefully and rested it gently on the top of her great head. She did not pull back. From the courtyard at the far end of the campus, where a group of faculty members had gathered after seeing the dragon fly overhead, 30 pairs of eyes watched in complete silence. Not one of them spoke. Roy did not know her name until 3 days later. He found out the way he found out most things at the academy. Not from anyone important. Not from the faculty or the administration. He found out from Doug, who had heard it from someone in the records office, who had heard it from someone else entirely. Her name was Vesa. And Vesa was not simply a wild dragon who had chosen the back section of the campus to build a nest. She was a bonded creature. One of the oldest on Sorvin. Her line went back 4 generations to the founding family of Valdris Academy itself, a family whose name was carved into the stone above the main entrance and whose legacy shaped nearly every important decision the Academy had made in the past 200 years. A bonded dragon was not a pet. She was not property. On Sorvin, a bonded creature held something close to legal standing. Her well-being was tied by ancient agreement to the institution she was connected to. Her acknowledgement of a person carried cultural and political weight that most humans on Sorvin did not fully understand. Roy certainly had not understood it. He found all of this out while eating his lunch behind the eastern shed, same as always, except that Doug sat across from him again, and this time Doug looked considerably less calm than usual. Doug told him that the Academy Council had called an emergency session the morning after Vesa's return. He said that 17 faculty members had witnessed what happened in the back section and that 3 of them had recorded it on personal devices. He said the footage had already been shared within the Academy's internal network and that it had not stayed internal for very long. Roy ate his sandwich and listened. Doug said that Vesa had not left the back section since she returned. She had let the Academy's creature relations staff treat her injuries, which was apparently something she had never permitted before from anyone outside the founding family. She had also allowed Roy to continue his morning visits without any sign of aggression, which the Creature Relations Office described in their official report as extraordinary and unprecedented. Roy had not thought of it as extraordinary. He had simply knocked on her side gently the first morning after, the way you might knock on a door, and waited to see if she minded. She had opened one amber eye, looked at him, and then closed it again. He had taken that as permission and gone about the feeding. Doug finished talking and looked at Roy carefully. Roy finished his sandwich and asked if he was in trouble about the wildlife statutes. Doug let out a long breath and said that Petra from Creature Relations had withdrawn the report entirely. Roy nodded and started on his second sandwich. The council meeting happened 2 days later. Roy was asked to attend, which surprised him. He put on the cleanest shirt he owned and walked to the main hall and sat in a chair that felt too large and too formal and waited. The council chamber was a tall round room with dark wooden walls and long windows that let in the pale Sorvin light. There were 14 council members seated in a curved row. Most of them were alien. 2 were human. All of them looked at Roy with expressions he could not quite read. The head of the council was an alien named Sorvith, tall and thin with pale skin and very steady eyes. Sorvith spoke carefully and precisely and explained to Roy the full significance of what Vesa's gesture had meant. He explained the history of the bonded line. He explained what it meant culturally on Sorvin for a creature of Vesa's standing to lower her head to a non-family member. Roy listened to all of it. When Sorvith finished, he asked Roy one question. He asked Roy why he had done it. Why he had kept going back. Why he had stayed through the cold night and spent his own money and ignored the warnings. Roy thought about it for a moment. He said he did not have a complicated answer. He said the hatchlings were hungry and cold and nobody else was doing anything about it, and he happened to be there. The chamber was quiet. One of the human council members, a woman named Grace who had said nothing up to that point, made a sound that was almost a laugh but not quite. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked down at the table. Sorvith looked at Roy for a long moment. Then he said that the Academy would be making several changes. Roy's position would be formalized with a significant increase in pay. He would be given official status as Vesa's primary human contact, a role that had never existed before and that carried its own standing under Sorvin law. The back section of the campus would be properly maintained and the nest area would be protected. Roy said that was fine. Outside the Academy walls, the story had already gone much further than anyone planned. The footage that had left the internal network had been picked up by 3 different interplanetary news channels. Not because anyone had pushed it. Simply because it was the kind of thing that travels on its own. A tired human groundskeeper. 4 dragon hatchlings. A cold night on the ground. A great dragon mother lowering her head. It was not a complicated story. That was probably why it moved so fast. On 17 different worlds that week, in universities and government halls and small homes with screens on the wall, people watched a 30-second clip of Roy crouching down to meet Vesa's eyes and placing his hand gently on her head. Nobody who watched it needed it explained. Roy went back to work the following Monday. Same tools. Same shed. Same route across the campus. Except that when he reached the back section that morning, Vesa lifted her great head and watched him walk toward the nest. The hatchlings came stumbling out to meet him. Roy opened his cloth bag and got to work.